You Only Live Twice is a Sean Connery James Bond film, in which Bond is apparently killed in the first few minutes. Of course, and I hardly consider this a spoiler, his death has been faked so he can more easily track down a technological villain who has been capturing spacecraft in flight. I by far prefer my Bonds, and spy films in general, to be goofy and over the top, and for the most part, this one delivers. The early scene in which the giant evil spacecraft appears to literally eat the US ship made me laugh out loud. The set piece for this particular movie is Japan, and we do get an unfortunate, poorly aged scene in which Bond disguises himself as a Japanese fisherman, but that is the worst moment of what is overall a decently fluffy and ridiculous action movie. Am I going to remember it in contrast to every other Bond pick? Absolutely not, but I had a good time watching it. Winter Light follows a disillusioned priest of a tiny village church throughout his day, seeing him do things like counseling with a man who has lost his faith and interacting with the unbelieving woman he's been having a secret affair with. His own faith is clearly barely alive at this point, and we watch him going through the motions to fulfill his priestly duties. There's a deep, devastating hopelessness to this movie that could easily be taken as a statement on the futility of religious beliefs overall. Although, as a religious person myself, I see it as being more about how ritual and tradition cannot alone keep someone's spirit alive. Director Ingmar Bergman's stark visual choices really showcase the deadness of this man's inner self. Sometimes black and white cinematography looks pristine and beautiful and fully alive, but here it is cold and wintry and lifeless. While I admire this film as a portrait of a particular person, I'm definitely unsatisfied by the ending. Of course, maybe that's the point, maybe the ending needs to be as unsatisfactory as the rest of this character's life. Either way, it's one I'll keep thinking about for a while. Margin Call is set in an investment bank, in the early stages of the 2007-2008 recession. A group of employees realize that things are about to collapse, and escalate this information to the higher-ups. Turns out, the only way to save the company is by getting rid of their assets as quickly as possible before they become valueless, which of course screws over all the people the bank works with, and that doesn't sit well with everyone. This is a tightly written thriller that manages to contain all its drama in one location at one point in time. I always admire films that can keep that narrow focus and still remain riveting. It's the theater nerd in me. The film does a good job of giving glimpses at each of these characters as they're confronted with this moral question, even if it doesn't have the time to fully flush all of them out. And that's enough for it to be a really satisfying watch. Also, is this the least sleazy person Kevin Spacey has ever played? It may be. It's a film that kept me interested through the whole runtime and never felt slow or made me impatient for something else to happen. Well written, well acted, well directed. Internal Affairs stars Andy Garcia as a police officer in the Internal Affairs Division who finds himself investigating Richard Gere, a police officer with an upstanding record but a hidden history of corruption. After months of watching Sidney Lumet's filmography, I kept forgetting that this wasn't a Lumet film. It was so like him in its themes and style, and even stars actors he worked with in the 80s and 90s, though without any of the spark that made him such a great director. However, the film does a good job of setting up the necessary stakes and building tension, and seeing Gere as a villain is a lot of fun. His smugness really works well to make us hate him here. As always, I find Garcia an uninteresting actor, but his character does his job here. This isn't a spectacular film, but it is pretty competent within a well-worn genre, and fans of that genre will probably enjoy this well enough. Don't Look Up is... well, let's call it a satire from Adam McKay about a pair of scientists who discover a comet is en route to hit the Earth and obliterate all life, but when they call it to the higher-ups' attention, nobody seems to be taking it very seriously. I'm hesitant to call this a satire because it doesn't feel like it's trying to actually make any points, it just seems to be screaming in frustration. And while it might be primarily a climate change metaphor, I felt it in my soul about the pandemic, and found myself just screaming right along with them and going, yes, that's exactly what it feels like. If I'm going to compare it to anything, it weirdly might be in the same category as like super angsty music for teens, in that it doesn't necessarily hold together on an objective artistic level, but it's the unfiltered cry of a furious soul, and it's going to connect with other furious souls. Should I have been nominated for a Best Picture Oscar? Almost certainly not. But did I find it a cathartic viewing experience? Absolutely. A Letter to Three Wives features three women in unsatisfying marriages who all get a letter from a woman in town saying she's run off with one of their husbands, but doesn't say who. The women are participating in a social event at the time, so we follow them throughout the day as they work and socialize, interspersed with flashbacks about their relationships that set up the mystery of who's run off and why. These three women are all so different that I never got bored watching each of their relationships go through their own unique struggles, and the mystery of which woman is going to end up alone is genuinely intriguing throughout the whole thing. It's one of those movies that has such a simple premise, but it makes its characters and plot lines so engaging that they hold your attention through the whole thing. And my favorite part is that a story that could easily be incredibly snarky and cynical manages to keep a through line of kindness and hope running through the whole thing, and perhaps even romance. It's a great movie that I'm glad I finally watched. Abraham Lincoln is a biopic of, well, the title character, focusing heavily on his early life, his relationship with Mary Todd, and his determination to preserve the country during the Civil War. The film was made by D.W. Griffith, and given his earlier extremely racist film The Birth of a Nation, I was not at all excited for a Lincoln biopic. While Griffith still definitely doesn't seem to be elevating Lincoln's anti-slavery decisions, focusing entirely on the unity factor, which I'm sure was primarily Lincoln's goal to begin with, he does laud the man as a hero, which I wasn't sure would be the case. That being said, the political pieces of this story are by far the least interesting, told in strange, halting pieces. I'd much rather see a full film on Griffith's take on the Lincoln-Todd marriage, which may not be accurate, but would at least be more entertaining. This isn't one I'd recommend overall. It's both boring and cinematically unspectacular. Dirty Harry stars Clint Eastwood as Harry Callahan, a cop who doesn't like to play by the rules. We follow his attempts to catch a serial killer despite the bureaucratic red tape holding him back from doing it the way he'd like. This probably shouldn't be a surprise, but I hated this film. I hate how this character is set up as a hero despite doing truly despicable things, and I especially hate when they deliberately set him up in the first 20 minutes as someone who supposedly protects women by being violent toward their attackers, and then just a few scenes later he peeps at a nude woman in her apartment while muttering something like, "You deserve to live a little, Harry." I hate this trope, I hate this character, and I hate this movie. The mystery itself would be fine in any other movie, but here it just seems mocking and sadistic when put up against its protagonist. I understand people love this movie, it is not for me. Last of the Mobile Hotshots is a Sidney Lumet film based on a Tennessee Williams play. The story follows a couple of strangers who got married on TV in exchange for a large amount of money, and now the newlyweds are returning to the man's rundown plantation. He dreams of restoring the home to its former glory and making it a tourist attraction, but his mixed-race half-brother, who is next in line for the property, has other plans. This synopsis took me longer than usual because the plot gets complicated. There are a lot of differing dynamics going on here between the three characters we have on screen, and that would be great if any of them were interesting. Mostly what ends up happening is characters go back and forth from one person to the next, just fighting over the same things over and over again without ever seeming to get anywhere. And Lynn Redgrave is just so hard to watch here. The combination of her thick accent, her high-pitched voice, and choice of intonation makes it sometimes almost impossible to track what she's saying, and it's hard to get to know her as a character, which I think we need to do for this to work. Not a great movie. Death on the Nile is Kenneth Branagh's sequel to Murder on the Orient Express, where he once again plays Detective Hercule Poirot, based on the popular mystery novels by Agatha Christie. Instead of being on a train, this time Poirot is accompanying a newlywed couple and their friends on a celebratory trip to Egypt when one of them is murdered. This is not as interesting a plot as Orient Express, neither in the cast of characters nor in the mystery's solution, though it does round up a decent ensemble of actors, including Gal Gadot, Letitia Wright, Annette Bening, and others. But where this film falters the most, I think, is in trying to shoehorn in a dramatic arc for Poirot himself. It's just not that kind of story, and it means that we never really lean as much as I want into the other characters being created, because I find myself kind of just waiting for Poirot's act to play out. It's definitely a step down from Branagh's previous Christie adaptation, even if the Christie formula is still strong enough to hold it together. The Rose stars Bette Midler as a rock star at the end of her rope, exhausted by endless touring and a controlling manager. We follow her as she tries to regain her footing and independence through a series of reckless adventures, accompanied by a newfound lover she hopes will help her change her ways. This was apparently initially conceived as a Janis Joplin biopic, but the family did not give consent, and I don't blame them. It's hardly a flattering look at our title character. So the story was fictionalized and turned into a general character study of a self-destructive rock star. This was Midler's film debut, and she's kind of amazing in it. She obviously nails the musical performances, of which there are many to enjoy, but she also really beautifully captures how her character yo-yos back and forth from being the life of the party to just collapsing. This kind of story has been told before, but making it a fictional story and not being beholden to anyone's memory in specific really allows it to dig into this character. And even though a lot of it is a little over the top, it suits the story. Pretty solid. Melvin and Howard tells the true story of Melvin Dumar, an average milkman who gives a strange hitchhiker a ride one night, only to discover that that man was Howard Hughes and that he's been left a piece of Hughes's fortune. While Dumar could certainly use the money, he has a difficult time convincing anyone that the will that includes him is genuine. The story is split between showing his financial difficulties before and after Hughes's death. I wonder what the real Melvin Dumar thought of this film, in which he's portrayed as kind of a horrible person. There's a level of not wanting him to win the money, because he doesn't seem to deserve a windfall like this. The movie is also awkwardly paced, and makes it tough to tell what the conflict actually is at any given moment, so we just meander through Melvin's life for a while, and then suddenly it kicks into gear in the last 40 minutes or so when Hughes dies, and it feels sloppily executed. The most interesting piece by far is the opening 15 minutes, which shows our one interaction between the two title characters, and that'd be a great little short film if not saddled with the rest of the movie. A Boy and His Dog is based off of a Harlan Ellison novella, in which a young man and a telepathic dog traverse a post-apocalyptic wasteland. When they meet a young woman, the man has to decide which of his two companions has more of a say in how he lives his life. This is a movie that caught my attention right from the beginning with its unusual premise, and it held it with its darkly comic tone and its refusal to explain much of its world. It reminds me quite a bit of the Mad Max series, although less elaborately technological. I found myself drawn into this world, especially as we begin to see multiple sides of it and the way various people have adapted to their new lives. The story ultimately doesn't go quite the way I expected, but I found it a fascinating time, and I'm glad I had the opportunity to watch it. Sneakerella is a Disney gender-swapped version of Cinderella, this time about a hopeful young sneaker designer named Elle who ends up meeting the daughter of a sneaker royalty family. The movie is also a musical, featuring several upbeat modern pop songs along with a cover of A Dream is a Wish Your Heart Makes. So this movie doesn't tread any new ground, really. The Cinderella story has been done to death, and nothing in the narrative of this remake really stands out. What does stand out, and makes this decently watchable, is some good musical choreography. The opening song and the villain song in particular are great fun, as well as how charismatic our lead is. Chosen Jacobs, who was in the 2017 adaptation of It, plays our hero, and he's just instantly someone you want to root for. Nobody else in the film is quite that interesting, which is unfortunate when it comes to building romantic chemistry, but Jacobs does a pretty good job of carrying everyone else along. Was this necessary? No. But was it okay? Sure. A Lady to Love stars Edward G. Robinson as an Italian immigrant who wants to find himself a wife, so he sends a proposal letter to a waitress he's taken a liking to. However, embarrassed by his own appearance, he sends her a photo of his young, attractive employee instead of himself. When the woman agrees to marry him and shows up thinking the employee is her intended husband, things get messy. This is the kind of role I haven't seen Robinson in much. I don't even know if he played these roles much. But in what could have been a very fluffy caricature role, he brings some serious pathos that makes me root for his character from moment one. Hungarian actress Vilma Banki plays his new bride, and while her performance isn't as impressive, she holds her own pretty well, especially in comparison to the actor making up the third in this love triangle who is incredibly flat. The story can't quite decide whether it wants to be sweet or tragic, and it keeps wavering between the two, although it does ultimately decide where to land. It's not amazing, but the performance is elevated a bit for me. 5 Feet Apart tells the story of a few teenagers with cystic fibrosis who spend their lives in and out of hospitals with infections and other complications. 2 of them, Stella and Will, hit it off and strike up a romance despite the risk to their personal health. This came out in 2019, right before most of us got a better concept of just how different it was to form or maintain a relationship with someone you couldn't physically be near without endangering yourself. Aside from that unusual little coincidence, there's not a lot really interesting about this movie, aside from it being a welcome representation of chronic terminal illness. It begs the obvious comparison to The Fault in Our Stars, except neither of these characters is nearly as charming as the ones in that novel, and the moments focusing on these teenagers' fight to live feel a little more saccharine and unearned. Much of the dialogue is overly expository, even about things the audience should be able to pick up, and the acting doesn't do much to overcome it. Overall, it would definitely have appealed to me as a teenager, myself obsessed with illness, but it's not one of the better examples of the genre. The Killers begins with 2 men arriving in a small town announcing they're going to kill one of the local gas station clerks. They do, and are gone before anything can be done about it, and the insurance investigator following up on his claim has to solve the mystery, interview by interview. I really enjoy how this film unravels the story a little at a time. with each relevant person the investigator speaks to giving us just a little bit more information. The script does a great job of adding a new emotional layer with each piece as well, with every person having a different emotional attachment to the target. That gimmick keeps it far more interesting than the story would have been if told in a strictly linear fashion. There are also some really stunning shots that help to bring out this atmosphere of intrigue and suspicion, which makes it all the more fun. This is what I wish most detective-centered noirs felt like. I really had a good time with this and enjoyed following along with the story. Nope is Jordan Peele's newest movie, focused on a family of Hollywood animal trainers whose business is quickly losing money after the patriarch is killed in a freak accident. But as weird things start happening, they start to wonder if their ranch is the site of some sort of extraterrestrial activity. Peele just keeps making it work. This is another really solid entry in his filmography. Daniel Kaluuya and Keke Palmer are truly delightful as two siblings who could not be more different, but band together to keep things going for their family business. I absolutely love the design of the creature they're chasing. It truly captures the horror of what we don't know or understand. I also love that so much of the horror happens in the middle of the day, under gorgeous bright blue skies and wide open spaces. It brings a Western sensibility to the horror genre, which was a ton of fun. While I wasn't as taken with the underlying meaning as I have been with Peele's previous efforts, this one definitely delivers on scares and action and tension, and it's worth seeing. Yes Day is a family comedy featuring Jennifer Garner and Edgar Ramirez as uptight parents. When Garner discovers that her kids think of her as a tyrant and a dictator, she decides to plan a Yes Day for them, in which she and her husband will agree to whatever they want to plan. The majority of the movie follows the hijinks that ensue as the kids determine the course of the day. This is absolutely a children's fantasy movie about being able to do whatever they want and go wherever they want. So it's a little weird that the protagonist is the mother more than the kids. Jennifer Garner is somehow simultaneously good and bad in this, with an obvious uncomfortable stiltedness in early scenes, and then one unexpectedly hilarious sequence in which she completely loses it on a stranger at the carnival. I literally went from thinking, this is why I don't like Jennifer Garner in anything, to thinking, hold on, is she actually a really talented comedian? As a whole, though, most of it isn't either very good or very bad. It's a cute movie about parents and children, no more. Come From Away is a filmed stage version of the Tony Award-nominated musical. It tells the story of a small town in Newfoundland, Canada, that became an emergency refuge for 38 US planes that were rerouted after the September 11th terrorist attacks. All the actors play multiple roles as both Canadians and passengers on the planes, with a very simple set consisting of mostly just some chairs and tables. A lot of the dialogue is pulled directly from first-hand accounts of the people who lived through this. This is really a show that needs to be seen rather than listened to. Nearly all the songs are interwoven with dialogue instead of being standalone pieces, and while that makes for kind of a mediocre cast album, it makes the whole story, when seen in its totality, beautifully coherent. These are also really solid performances. There's not one actor struggling to pull their weight, and that's impressive in such a large ensemble cast. A musical about 9/11 could easily be cloying and cheesy, but the story handles itself beautifully and ends up being the best kind of inspirational. It's a Gift stars W.C. Fields as a henpecked grocery store owner with a dream of owning an orange ranch someday, and when the chance for his dream comes true, he decides to go for it and make it a reality. While watching this, I realized I've maybe never seen a W.C. Fields film before, certainly not one where it was his vehicle. I like him more than I like the movie. He's got some more subtlety to his delivery than a lot of other comedians of the same time, and while that doesn't make him better than them, it does make him stand out. His aimless bumbling is quiet enough that it makes space for a lot of other jokes to land. Where it doesn't work is that every character in this film is deeply unlikable, and I don't really want to root for any of them to do well. I just want them off my screen as soon as I can get them off. But despite the miserable cast of characters, Fields' work is creative enough that I do want to check out more of his films. Maybe there'll be another one that works for me more fully. Guilty as Sin tells the story of a hotshot female lawyer who decides to represent a womanizer accused of murdering his wife. At first it seems like business as usual, but the more they work together, the more she becomes convinced he not only did it, but may be a danger to others. This is pretty much exactly what I want out of a fun thriller. The stakes are high, the story is a little bit unbelievable, but the emotion is realistic, proportionate to the circumstances, and the acting is a little cheesy, but totally works. Are there plot holes left and right? Oh, probably. But picking those apart isn't nearly as fun as just enjoying the wild twists the story throws at me. It made me feel trapped on the level of a supernatural slasher film, where you just always have this creeping sense that the killer is never really dead. He's always going to find a way to come back. This isn't anywhere near Sidney Lumet's most masterful work, but I had a ton of fun with it, and I'm glad I saw it. Shoot the Moon stars Albert Finney and Diane Keaton as a couple with 4 daughters who are in the process of dissolving their marriage. We see both of them try to navigate single parenthood, begin new relationships, and wrap things up somewhat civilly, although neither of them is very good at that last part. Writer Bo Goldman stated that the inspiration for this story was seeing how couples' breakups affected their children, and the children are easily the most interesting part of this story. These kids are rambunctious and nosy, very much in the way a lot of real kids are, and they're affected by their parents' breakup in unexpected but realistic ways. Finney and Keaton spend most of their time being as petty to each other as they can, and without witty dialogue or an occasional catharsis, it gets old pretty quickly, but there's a bit of saving grace in their relationship with their kids. And the movie certainly ends in a way I didn't expect, but it wasn't one of those times where just being surprising was enough to make me care about it overall. It's a good cast in a not very good movie. The Unbearable Weight of Massive Talent stars Nicolas Cage as himself, wondering if he should give up acting. He takes one last gig, which turns out to tangle him up in both international espionage and a once-in-a-lifetime bromance. The concept of this movie is fun, but in so many ways it's a weaker version of adaptation. The meta-commentary, the real-life artists struggling to create, even two Nicolas Cages arguing with each other. It's not unpleasant, but having just watched adaptation, a lot of the similar humor and twists don't land as well here. What does make this movie work for me is the warm friendship between Cage and Javi. Even as Cage is making plans to take down Javi or turn him into the US government, we feel how strong their bond is, and we hope for things to turn out right. And not to give too much of a spoiler, but when they ultimately start fighting on the same side, it's deeply satisfying. Pedro Pascal plays Javi and is incredibly charming, and I don't think the movie would have been the same with someone else in the role. Overall, a fluffy, fun watch. But if you want something headier, adaptation is right there. RRR is an Indian movie set during British rule of India. It tells the story of 2 men who become friends, one who is a British police officer and one who is trying to retrieve a girl kidnapped from his village by one of the British city leaders. They don't realize at first that their goals are opposite to each other, but when they do, it strains their friendship. This movie got a lot of attention for its over-the-top action sequences, and those are indeed pretty delightful. It only has a couple of songs, but those songs are used to incredible effect. Far better to have only a few that are done well than a whole bunch that don't really matter. And most of all, the story of these 2 men's bond is heartwarming and well told. We get flashbacks showing their pasts and what brought the 2 of them to be the people they are today, and seeing those backstories makes it so easy to root for both of them to get what they want and reconnect. Are the action scenes wild and fun and unpredictable? Absolutely, but there's also a core warmth to this movie that works just as well. Nightmare Alley, directed by Guillermo del Toro, follows a carnival worker played by Bradley Cooper. He learns the secrets of the mentalists and decides to branch out with the act on his own, but finds himself drawn to a much darker world than he anticipated. This is a long movie, and I gotta be honest, I felt every minute of its length. This is the kind of style-driven noir mystery that I know a lot of people would love. It did get nominated for an Oscar after all, but for me it falls far short of almost everything else del Toro has ever done. This color palette is somehow more depressing than anything he's done previously, and these characters are boring at best and unpleasant at worst, and I don't want to spend hours in their company. There are 1 or 2 interesting moments. I do like the brief subplot of exchanging psychological analysis for inside information, but overall I found it just plodding and dull and unpleasant. Somebody who loved this movie, tell me what made it interesting to you, because I did not get it. Avalon follows the Jewish immigrant and his family in the early days of television. We begin with his initial journey to assimilate into the United States, and then follow his family's attempts to become successful. A lot of this, though not all, is told through the eyes of his young grandson, played by Elijah Wood. Although I've been able to sum up the story reasonably succinctly there, the story is not that coherent in terms of what it is actually about. It shifts constantly from focusing on the grandfather, the father, and the son in ways that I found occasionally a little jarring. I'm happy to believe that's my problem rather than the movie's, but it does mean that the ending, which makes it sound as if the film was meant to be centered around the main patriarch the whole time, hits a little strangely. The movie definitely has some good moments and a couple of plot threads that I found really engaging, and the many scenes of the whole family interacting were always enjoyable to watch, with all these personalities coming to the forefront, but something about the movie just falls short for me at the end. A good effort that doesn't quite land. Skater Girl tells the story of a group of children living in a poor village in India. A visiting woman buys the children skateboards and even invests in building a skate park for them, and one young girl in particular discovers how much she loves to skate. I really like Rachel Sanchita Gupta as our titular skater girl. This is her first film, and she is likable and relatable, and you want to root for her, even when the story doesn't work for me. Like a lot of inspirational sports stories, there are obstacles placed in the character's way that they must overcome to succeed, and here the obstacles seem so vast that I can't imagine her win could actually play out like it does. Like, really, what is actually going to happen to this child once the movie is over? The story and its successes aren't quite big enough to convince me, even in an inspirational movie where all they want to do is convince me that they can make a meaningful difference against opponents like societal traditions. If you are convinced by that, I think you'll like this movie a lot. If you aren't, you'll likely find it a little empty. The Black Phone is a horror movie based on a short story by Joe Hill. It's set in a town where children are going missing, and one day our protagonist goes missing as well. We follow him trying to escape his captor with the help of the previously missing children, who are communicating with him from beyond the grave via the titular Black Phone. It's an interesting conceit, and I appreciate how the film keeps so much of the mystery intact. We never really know how this works, or why the killer is doing what he's doing. It stays in murky uncertainty, which makes it much more interesting than if we got a big old backstory. It sets up a good creepy atmosphere that works, even as the film feels like a short story, somewhat incomplete, though it's hard to pinpoint exactly what is missing here. It's not a stellar horror film, but it does its job pretty well, and is a fun little diversion as far as horror movies go, even if it doesn't always hang together. My Daughter's Killer is a documentary about a man whose young daughter suddenly dies abruptly, and her father becomes convinced that her stepfather killed her, and he orchestrates an abduction to bring the stepfather from Germany to France, where he can be tried for his crimes. This feels less like a feature-length story and more like a 45-minute true crime podcast. That's not a bad thing, just a slightly different feel than I expected, and it leaves me feeling like I don't have enough to say about it. The film opens making you think it's leaning toward a much darker vigilante justice story than it ultimately does, so I started prepared to hate our main character and ended up being more sympathetic toward him than I was initially. There's just not a lot for me to comment on in this movie. If you like this kind of true crime story, you'll probably like this movie, and if you're kind of iffy on them like I am, it's fine, but not that great.